Hello, and welcome to another oddly specific video where we'll be looking at two exam style questions that I've made up to do with my class today to make as specific as possible, like things that haven't been asked by VCAR potentially before. One of them definitely hasn't been asked by them recently. The other one's kind of been asked similarly before, but I think it's very important. These are things that could come up in the end of year exam, which now has a date that exists on Thursday, the 11th of November at 3 p.m. So you should know when your exam is and be prepared for that. But we're going to go through these two questions, basically how the marking allocation would be for it, in my opinion, and then looking at a sample answer that I just wrote, which probably took me much longer than I prefer to admit. So we'll get straight into it with looking at the key knowledge and skills that we're going to talk about, and then carry on from there looking at the questions. So first up, we're looking at factors which affect our international competitiveness, so things including relative interest rates, demand for exports and imports, capital flows, terms of trade, and what will become very important is this relative rates of inflation. That's what we're going to talk about specifically. We're also going to talk about the effects of exchange rate movements on the current account balance, domestic macroeconomic goals, and living standards. In our case, we're going to specifically tie that into just like aggregate supply. We're going to look at that very specifically in here. Key skills here: explain trends, patterns, similarities, differences in economic data and other information, and to be able to access, interpret, draw conclusions from information gathered from a range of sources. And these two questions are basically purely theoretical, so they're going to require you to be able to look at concepts and explain how they impact on other concepts. It's going to be really important that you can take that one concept, explain what it means, and then say how it will impact on various other things. So to get straight into our first question, we are going to talk about analyze how higher relative rates of inflation to our trading partners is likely to impact on the balance of current account. One specific thing very quickly is I've gone with the balance on current account because that's how I think VCAR is going to ask about the current account in questions. Although in the study design it says things about the current account deficit, cyclical and structural current account deficit, reasons for those things. We've been in a current account surplus for the last year or so. Therefore, it's really important that you're not going to be talking about a current account deficit unless you're talking about historically. So it's going to be important to talk about the balance on current account. What's coming up here is we're going to be talking about how a higher relative rate of inflation to our trading partners. This is something that hasn't really come up in a question before, but is listed in the study design very specifically. And if it's listed in the study design, it means VCAR can ask about it in a question. And so analyzing how a higher relative rate of inflation to our trading partners is likely to impact on the balance of current accounts. So you've got to break this question down into what it wants from you. Being an analyzed question, that's going to be really important, that whenever you get an analyzed question in economics, usually that means that you're talking about multiple effects. So there's going to be more than one effect that you need to talk about. So that's going to be really important to get those full marks there. Often people only talk about one effect and then they get 3 out of 4 and they're very disappointed. You don't want to be one of those students. You want to get full marks for the question because you want to get those high study scores. Then you're going to brag about till you don't remember what you got anymore because you're my age and you're an adult who study scores don't really matter to. But for now, they do kind of matter because you want to get into university courses. So let's talk about what a higher relative rate of inflation means. Higher relative rate of inflation means that prices are increasing in Australia. So prices are going up in Australia at a rate faster than our trading partners. So the prices are increasing with our trading partners, but not at a same rate. So that's really important to talk about. So like your first mark, you're going to be talking about what that higher relative rate of inflation means. So you're going to be like describing, oh, if I can spell describing, a higher relative rate of inflation. So when you're talking about that, you're going to be talking about the fact that prices in Australia are increasing at a rate higher or faster than our trading partners. So that in general, the average level of prices is increasing more than our trading partners. It's really important. That's going to get that first mark to really highlight what that situation is. Then your next 2 marks. So what most people are going to do is talk about how that's going to impact our exports. So talking about the impact on exports, which is going to be decreased credits, which is going to be decreased in the balance of goods and services. Most people do that and they'll just go to the last mark, which is the overall impact on current account. But it's really important that you do the 2 effects. It's an analyzed question. It wants 2 effects. So the other effect is the effect it has on imports, which if there is a higher relative rate of inflation compared to our trading partners, that means that domestic goods and services have increased in price. So there's increased price on domestic goods. That means that we are going to import more because it's relatively cheaper. And that's going to mean that there is increased debits, which is going to decrease the balance of goods and services. And that's going to lead to the last mark, the overall impact on current account, which is going to be that because of those decreased credits and increased debits, we are going to have a reduced current account surplus, or is going to bring us closer to a current account deficit. It's really important that you hit all of those points because that's what it wants from you. So if we were to look at my sample answer, a higher relative rate of inflation compared to our trading partners refers to the average level of prices increasing in Australia at a rate faster than the nations we trade with. If prices are rising at a faster rate in Australia compared to our trading partners, this would be unfavorable for our exports due to a relative increase in price. This would mean there's a decrease in credits to net goods and net services in the current account and an overall decrease in the balance of goods and services. That's the first 2 marks. Then the third mark, at the same time, a higher relative rate of inflation means that the cost of domestic goods and services is increasing in comparison to our imports. It's very important to make that point rather than saying imports would increase, because you're not really saying why imports would increase. So this means that consumers are more likely to switch to purchasing relatively cheaper imports from our trading partners, which increases the level of debits to net goods and net services, once again decreasing the overall balance of goods and services. Overall, this decrease in credits and increase in debits in the balance of goods and services means that the current account surplus is likely to fall or move towards a current account deficit. As you can see, there's a lot to that, but it's really specific step by step. One of the things I've been noticing recently with my own students is that they often forget to talk about the sub-account of the current account that comes up. They will talk about the credits or the debits, but you need to mention that sub-account and how it's being affected before you talk about what the effect is on the current account. Really, really important that you do that. So that is this question. Hopefully you've done all right with that. It's very, very similar to the weirdly 4-mark describe question about describe how relative interest rates changing could affect the exchange rate. That was on the 2020 exam, but I want to do this one because relative rates of inflation haven't really come up that much. Now to move on to our next question, which is relatively easier overall. Explain the impact of an appreciation of the Australian dollar on our aggregate supply. So this was a lot simpler, but it's something that a lot of people are really good at talking about, the effects of changes in the Australian dollar on aggregate demand. But when aggregate supply comes up, either they can describe it and they miss out on a few things, or they kind of just go off the rails a little bit and kind of still talk about it from demand. So for the first part, the first mark, you're going to talk about what an appreciation means. So explain what an appreciation is. So what an appreciation is. So you're going to be talking about the fact that an appreciation of the Australian dollar refers to the value of our currency increasing in comparison to the value of another currency. Very, very important there. For your next mark, you're going to be talking about how that leads to a decrease in cost of production for businesses who use inputs that are imports. So businesses that use imports as inputs in production are going to have a decreased cost of production, because if the exchange rate appreciates, that means they're able to purchase more imports as inputs in their production, or they're able to get them at a cheaper rate, or they can get more for the same price. This decrease in the cost of production means that firms are able to, they're more incentivized to increase their production or increase their production overall, as they're able to produce more with the same cost of production as earlier. And it's going to get to the overall point of the overall increase in aggregate supply. This one, there's a lot less to it. It's a lot more step by step. It's a lot shorter overall. So if we are to skip across to the sample answer on this one, it's an appreciation of the Australian dollar means that our currency is now worth more in comparison to the currency of other nations. If the Australian dollar was to appreciate, this would mean that businesses who use imports as factors of production would have a reduced cost of production, as their imported inputs would now cost them less overall. So that's the first 2 marks basically there. This reduction in cost of production would mean that businesses are more willing and able to produce, as they are able to produce more goods and services with the same inputs, therefore increasing our aggregate supply overall. So this one's a lot simpler. It's just straight to the point, like 1 mark there, 1 mark there, and then 1 mark there. Just bang, 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 nice and easy. But you really need to get that really clear point across about businesses who use imports as factors of production will have a lowered cost of production. I've noticed a lot of people when they talk about this talk about all businesses being better off, but that's not true. Many businesses who don't use imports as factors of production are worse off if the exchange rate appreciates. It's very specifically tied to businesses who use imports as factors of production. And that's the really important thing to point out about why that could increase our aggregate supply overall, is that those businesses are more able and willing to produce because of their decreased cost of production. And that's essentially it for these 2 practice exam style questions. Let me know if you want anything more like this before your upcoming Unit 3 Area Study 3 SACs, depending on what's going on, because we are in lockdown, the world's a mess. Who knows what's happening in Victoria, but with luck, all these assessments will be getting done soon. If you want more of this, let me know. If there's any other types of questions you want to come up, let me know specifically. Email me, Sean@therunningeconomy.com. Thank you for watching my oddly specific presentation about exam style questions. Head to my website if you want to see some blogs. I'm probably going to write a blog later today or tomorrow that rips into Harvey Norman about the fact they pocketed $22 million in JobKeeper despite having a 116% increase in profits. That's more because I want people to be more aware of the fact that Harvey Norman is a terrible company, and I'm trying to get Harvey Norman to block me on Twitter. But that's a different thing altogether. Other than that, on my website, there's also a link to a Discord where there's a lot of really strong students helping each other out in economics. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.